Welcome back, everybody, Americans, to rejoin the Constitution study. And today I have with me Nurse Nicole and Nurse Jodi, and we're going to talk about, they're from Nurses Out Loud, also heard in America Out Loud Talk Radio. And we're going to talk about an interesting story we've both covered from different points of view. But before I get started, nurses, welcome to the Constitution study.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
I'm so glad you could join me. So I've talked before about, well, the sad story, the truly awful story of Grace Shara and what was done to her by the medical profession. Nurses Out Loud, you recently did a podcast where you talked about this case from a medical standpoint. So why don't you refresh my audience's memory about what happened to Grace and what was going on that kind of led to this court case?
Yeah, so we had Grace Shara that was brought into Ascension Hospital, St. Elizabeth's Ascension Hospital in Wisconsin by her father after going to urgent care and testing positive for COVID, and also showing some low oxygen levels that were concerning. And they had requested that he'd be proactive and take her to the hospital because Grace also has Down syndrome and is more high risk for respiratory issues progressing pretty quickly. And so she was admitted to the hospital where quickly things turned. And Scott, being her POA, her person, and never leaving her side her entire life due to her disability and not being able to make formal decisions without her legal guardians, had stayed with her and quickly realized that there were a lot of things not being met from a legal standpoint. Standardization of care within the hospital did not look like it was unfolding as it should. And a lot of things led to her decline with COVID and removal of an advocate at the bedside, and also medications being introduced that was discussed. Was it possibly an overdose versus oversedation? But the biggest kicker, the one that just really stood out the most, was she was made a do not resuscitate without the family's consent. And that was held to by the hospital when things did go bad, and was not reversed when the family asked for it over the phone via FaceTime when she was passing.
Now, to explain to a POA is a power of attorney. It's the
Yeah,
person that has the legal authority to consent for someone else.
correct.
Right.
Yes.
That's going to become very important as we move forward, because what you're saying is the person with the right to consent for a mentally impaired person was removed and not allowed, and they implied consent after removing the only person that had the legal authority to consent for her.
Correct.
Yeah,
Yes.
this is correct. And also too, just to give some context, this happened in September of 2021.
October of 2021.
October of 2021. And furthermore, Scott, her father, when he was removed, he had asked to speak to the charge nurse. And when the charge nurse arrived, she arrived with security. And yes, he was removed for 48 hours. Grace did not have an advocate at her bedside for 2 days. He had to go to court, and they allowed her sister, who was not as involved in her care.
Right.
Well, her sister also did not have, I mean, the power of attorney is not, it's a legal document.
Right.
It's I mean, it's not a court order, but it is a legal document that says this person is allowed to. I've been dealing with, my father's getting older, right? My sister and I share power of attorney for my father should he become unable to make decisions for himself. That's a tremendous responsibility, but it's I have the legal authority to not only make decisions for my father, but to demand the ability to make those legal decisions for my father. And the courts, you're telling me the court simply ignored that and substituted somebody else. Did the courts give a reason?
So I think what happened was when Scott was removed, the 48 hours, went into motion where she didn't have an advocate, and Scott, Shara, and family were trying to seek legal counsel to try to bring in a representative because Grace does have Down syndrome, and per the ADA, she was required and allowed to have an advocate present. That was denied during that time. And so I think the common ground was is that because the wife at the time, Miss Cindy, had COVID, and during that time you weren't allowed to be in the hospital if you had COVID, and Scott had just recently been trespassed, the next person in line was the sister Jessica, who was brought in, who could be at the bedside and help, and then all medical decisions would still have to go through Scott on the phone.
Now, what was the reason for the trespass?
So essentially, they were saying that Scott was being difficult. It was documented at one point by one nurse in the documentation that he, was the word difficult. He was asking a lot of questions. He was basically trying to press the team on what was happening, why things were happening. And I think that just kind of followed along in the charting. But during the actual hearing, you heard from multiple individuals at that hospital who actually verbalized they never had a problem with Scott and that he was not, in fact, difficult. So that part was quite interesting because the general consensus was he was not being difficult. However, at one point he was removed for questioning and I guess, trying to really press the team on why things were happening.
But then again, if he's being difficult, I years ago, um, my father-in-law was in the hospital with a couple of, he had one condition, and then they had another condition. And the problem was my mother-in-law was of the age, she grew up, you never questioned a doctor. The doctor was God. And the
Right.
problem is nobody, I don't know if they weren't explaining it to her well, or she just isn't quite comprehending.
Right.
And I offered, I said, give me have him sign a power of attorney. I'll get the answers, because that's the role of an advocate is I need answers, and I'm making decisions. And if the medical facilities, the medical professionals are not following the advocate's requests, there's a problem there. Unless unless they're asking for something unethical,
Right.
so I that's why I'm curious is, was it difficult, or was he was, like I said, asking questions, he was getting in the way of the treatments they wish to perform for COVID, which we know the let's say just its treatment schedule was not well, let's say the ones approved by the CDC were not medically sound.
Right.
Yep.
And
Basically.
right. And I think it was just more or less the fact that during that time they would find any reason, when I say they, hospitals, hospital staff, if anybody was really questioning or pushing or just taking up a lot of time or, just more time than they felt at that time was appropriate, they would use that as an excuse with the laws in place and different things during the pandemic that were implemented to remove family, right? To remove the advocate, because as nurses, the general consensus is if you don't have other individuals to have to deal with, the thought process is a little bit easier. And so sometimes removing that advocate means you have quote unquote less work and you can just do what you need to do and not be interrupted or have as much pushback. And so I think that was possibly part of the reason that happened because the family had been very clear on their treatment plan for Grace. It was to get her better and bring her home. And they had repeatedly told the staff every day that they were asked, they did not want to make her do not resuscitate. And so to hear that it was placed on her file, they were so confused and had no idea how that could have happened.
So
Furthermore, it's also important to understand that the culture had changed on the unit. From the point that we had removed the advocate, what, in April, May of 2020, now you have a culture that has been doing what they want to do, though the standards of care were lower. Doctors were not going in the room and assessing patients. Nurses were not going in and charting what we need to chart every hour, pain, potty, position, right? So, like Nurse Nicole said, when you don't have an advocate that's on the call light saying, my, mom needs to go to the bathroom, or she wants to get up to the chair, or she wants to shower, or they want to eat, or, they need pain medication. You don't have people on call lights anymore.
mm.
Okay. And so that's very important to understand that was happening.
Now, as I understand it, and again, I'm not a medical professional, I don't play one on TV. Um, in order to do something like give a DNR, you need consent. I mean, you're in the hospital, you're signing your name like you're buying a house. Everything needs consent, correct?
Correct.
But if
Correct.
Grace
Yeah.
was incapable of providing consent because of her Down syndrome, how did they get consent for the DNR? And if they didn't get consent for the DNR, well, what should have been the ramifications for that?
So I think with the DNR, for most states, you have to have legal documentation. You have to be able to clearly state what you want, what you don't want. A DNR is different than a do not intubate or a DNI, which is something that was also brought up during the case. But again, you usually have to have paperwork to say that you don't want it, in addition to an order, in addition to a ban that's placed on the patient. There's multiple steps that you have to take that clearly none of those were done, which is even more alarming to know. But also in some states, and especially during the pandemic, two physicians could come together to make a decision and put someone as a DNR. Not quite sure if that's what happened because that information was not put out in that hearing. But essentially, there are workarounds, if you will, where sometimes those decisions can be made. But ultimately, it's documentation that has to be written out to clearly state that you want something and you don't. And
But
in
in order for two physicians to institute a DNR without consent, it's because consent isn't available, right? The person's unconscious and cannot get consent, and there's nobody with a POA to provide that consent. That was not the case. The person with the POA was physically removed from the hospital, but was still available via phone and the internet.
correct.
So this was not a situation where two doctors could legally consent to issuing a DNR. And
Absolutely.
I'm still,
And it,
what's happened to these doctors? What's happened to the
nothing,
hospital?
nothing. Here's something that's even more alarming is that a jury said that it was okay
Right.
for the doctor to make her a DNR. The jury ruled. Okay. So that's even more mind blowing that a jury said that it's okay for a doctor to arbitrarily, right?
Right.
I mean, basically is what he did, make her a DNR without the family's consent. That's what the ruling came down.
Right.
That's why Nurse Nicole and I did a show on it, because we were just as mind blown that this happened. How could this happen? We could go and talk to our peers and say, did you know that it's okay for a doctor just to do this? And a jury of 12 or 13, whatever it was, said it was okay. That's the even scarier part
Right.
of this.
Yeah. I don't know. I wasn't there. I didn't hear, but my first expectation is that's what you get when you get a poor attorney or an attorney that argues based on opinions rather than the actual law.
Right.
Then again, it's also probably one of the reasons why I imagine a lot of attorneys wouldn't want me on a jury because I know things and they don't like that. So at this point, so you've got effectively you have two doctors murder this young lady, right? DNR. You have um, a jury of 12, either for whatever reason, that said, yeah, it was okay, that to decide that this life was not worth keeping. And like I said, I've talked with Scott. I've interviewed him here on the program. This has now consumed his life, dealing with the consequences of these horrendous decisions. Like I said, and the doctors in the hospitals have paid no price.
Right. And essentially, just to clarify, for this particular case, there was only one physician that signed that order. That was the one that was called into question, that was relinquished of all wrongdoing. I was speaking towards some of the other instances where if there
Oh,
wasn't an advocate, that
yep.
two physicians could. But again, it set a precedence in motion to let the world know, or at least the United States know, that this can happen and you won't be held accountable. And what that sent out into the medical movement, the shockwaves of, could this happen to us or our family? And what do you do to prevent this from happening? How can you ensure that this never happens to someone again? Because Scott was the POA. There was documentation. There were things in place, and yet all of these things still happened. And that's what we can't wrap our head around. And a 3-week trial ended in 15 minutes of deliberation, and 11 out of the 12 said that nothing was done incorrectly. again, the DNR being a huge part of this, because verbally or in writing, you can revoke a DNR at any point in time across, multiple states. And they did so over FaceTime and pleaded with the staff as the sister was showing her, Grace taking her last breath, and they stood down. They had a duty to act, and they didn't do anything, and watched her die, and said that this was in motion and that they couldn't do anything about it, which we have never. Jodi and I have been in the industry, 2 decades plus, that we've never heard anything like this before. And the fact that it just ruled on a federal level that this is appropriate and that this can happen, it is, terrifying, absolutely terrifying. But
Yeah.
also, what do you do to ensure this doesn't happen again?
Well, it goes
Right.
to show that, DNRs and powers of attorney, ultimately they're pieces of paper. And we need people, especially in law enforcement, that will actually enforce the law. That the Scott should have been able to get a call 911 and say that, the hospital's kidnapped my daughter and treating her without consent, and gotten some support there. That didn't happen. Yeah, he should have. The details of the jury, I don't know, but that is, we have to be responsible for our own safety and our own rights, and
Well, and
we not simply rely on, oh, I have a piece of paper, that's all I need. That piece of paper didn't save Grace.
Mhm. And not to mention that her nurse should have acted.
Yeah.
Her nurse should have acted. As nurses, we hold our own license. We don't just blindly follow orders. And when you have the family on FaceTime and the daughter, her sister, crying out to help her, the nurse should have intervened and hit that code blue and had the team and then have a discussion.
Right.
I can't tell you how many times I have been involved with a patient who the patient themselves said, I want to be a DNR. And the family, when it's happening in front of their face, they revoke it. And a lot of us protest to the doctor, like, no, we heard the patient say this, but the doctor, acquiesces. And all of a sudden, we are performing life saving, heroic measures on a patient who didn't want it.
Right.
And that's because they were so risk adverse. Now, this was prior to COVID.
Right.
Since COVID, and not only having the PrEP Act as immunity free and liability free, you also have a lot of egos going around, that are acting every day based on institutionalized systemic protocols and policies that they have been doing for the last 5 years that do not put the patient front and center. So as nurses, with Nurses Out Loud, our voice is to, equip the nurses with the tools and the ethics and the courage to speak up, because our duty is to the patient, not to policy, not to protocol, not to a order, and not to our paycheck.
Amen.
Yes, absolutely. Well, nurses, we've gone a little long, but I thank you for your time, because again, this is the medical view of this. I've had the legal view. Tell my audience where they can listen more to Nurses Out Loud.
Go ahead, Jodi.
Yes, you can find us on all the platforms at Nurses Out Loud. On all of the social medias. We have every social media, and we also have Nurses Out Loud website and the Substack as well.
And on Rumble.
Oh, I
And
know
on
Rumble. Well, again, thank you very much for your time. Let's keep in touch, because I'm sure there's going to be more interesting things popping up, and we'll have you back again in the near future.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Paul.
Hi, Jodi.